Royal Air Force Polebrook, Northamptonshire, February 20, 1944. Late afternoon, with the light already going out of an English winter sky. A Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress is turning onto its final approach over the runway. It is coming home. It has crossed the North Sea. It has crossed the coast. It is over friendly ground, over its own airfield, over the grass it took off from that morning. There are no enemy fighters within 400 miles of it. There is no anti-aircraft fire. There is nothing left to kill it. Below, on the perimeter track, men are standing and watching. Crash crews are waiting. Ambulances are waiting. The base commander is watching. A senior officer is flying alongside in another fortress, close enough to see into the cockpit, talking to the men inside over the radio. And the men in the cockpit cannot fly the aeroplane. One of them is a navigator. He has spent the war behind a small table in the nose of a bomber, working with charts and a drift meter and a stopwatch. The other is a flight engineer, a man whose trade is engines and hydraulics and machine guns. Neither of them is a pilot. Neither of them has ever landed a heavy bomber. Between them they have perhaps a few hours of informal instruction, the kind of unofficial familiarization that crews sometimes gave each other in case the worst happened. Behind them, most of the crew is gone. They have already jumped, on orders, and they are floating down safely over Northamptonshire and walking away from this story alive. In the left-hand seat, the pilot is unconscious and dying. He cannot be moved. He cannot be dressed in a parachute. He cannot be pushed out of a hatch by two men in an aircraft that will fall out of the sky the instant they let go of the controls. The two men who cannot fly the aeroplane have been ordered, twice, to abandon it. They have been told by an officer flying beside them that they will not survive a landing attempt. Their parachutes are on. The hatch is there. Every rule of survival, every instinct of self-preservation, every piece of arithmetic that governed the American bomber offensive says the same thing. Go. They will not go. They make one approach and it does not work. They go around. They make a second approach and it does not work. They go around again. And on the third attempt, in the last of the light, the fortress strikes rising ground a few miles from the field and comes apart. The navigator is killed. The flight engineer is killed. The pilot they refuse to abandon dies of his injuries. 3 men die on English soil, within sight of home, at the end of a mission they had already survived. The record of what they said is preserved in the plainest language imaginable, in a document that was never intended to be moving, and which is, for that reason, devastating. It appears in the official citation for the Medal of Honor, drafted by the War Department, written in the flat administrative prose of a military decoration. It reads that the pilot was still alive but could not be moved, and that they would not desert him. Read it again, because it is doing something strange. It is not a claim of courage. It is not a boast. It is a description of a decision reported in the past tense, as though it were procedural. It has the tone of a duty roster. The 2 men were asked a question by their commanding officer, and they gave an answer, and the answer was no. That answer killed them. It also killed the man they were trying to save, because the aeroplane they could not fly did not land, and he was inside it when it hit the ground. Judged on outcomes alone, judged the way a staff officer judges things, it was a failure. 3 dead where 2 could have lived. And the United States Army, an institution that ran on arithmetic, that measured aircrew in loss percentages and replacement rates and mission tallies, that had written into its own operational doctrine the cold and explicit instruction that damaged aircraft were to be left behind, looked at that decision and gave both men the Medal of Honor. That is the thing worth explaining, not the courage. The courage is obvious and it is not in dispute. The puzzle is institutional. Why did an Air Force whose entire theory of survival was built on abandonment reward, with its highest decoration, 2 men who refused to abandon? Because the abandonment was not incidental. It was not a failure of compassion or a lapse in discipline. It was the doctrine. It was written down. It was taught. It was the mathematics on which the whole enterprise rested, and men who violated it endangered everybody else in the sky. Here is the fact that makes the paradox unavoidable. On that same day, February 20, 1944, over the same target, on the same mission, another American pilot, flying with a different bomb group, made exactly the same choice. His name was William Lawley. His co-pilot was dead, his aeroplane was burning, and he had wounded men aboard who physically could not bail out. He was told he could jump. He refused to leave them. He flew the wreck back across the channel and crash-landed it at Redhill, a small fighter airfield in Surrey. It was his 10th combat mission. He lived. His wounded men lived. He also received the Medal of Honor, 2 aircraft. One day, one identical decision, taken independently by men who did not know each other and who were separated by 100 miles of sky. One crew survives, and one crew does not. Both refusals are honored. Both violate the same doctrine. This is not a story about one heroic crew. It is a story about a pattern, and a pattern needs an explanation. The explanation is not what you would expect, and it is worth clearing away the obvious answers first, because they are all wrong. It was not sentimentality. The United States Army Air Forces of 1944 was dispatching hundreds of young men to their deaths every week and calculating whether the exchange rate was acceptable. It was not superior training. American aircrew training was in many respects rushed, and the men who made these decisions were frequently on their first or second combat tours. It was not a written order. There was no regulation anywhere in the United States military instructing a pilot to remain with a man who could not jump. There is, in fact, no formal doctrine anywhere in the American Armed Forces that says, "Leave no man behind." That phrase is not in any field manual. It never was. We will come back to that, because it is the key to the whole thing, and it was certainly not American exceptionalism in courage. Royal Air Force Bomber Command lost 55,573 men, killed out of roughly 125,000 aircrew, a death rate approaching 45%, worse than the 8th Air Force endured. Nobody has ever accused those men of a shortage of nerve. The answer lies somewhere nobody looks. It lies in a converted country house on the Potomac River in Virginia, in a Kansas classroom where a young colonel was doing geometry, and in a 2-page form that did not exist until the middle of 1943. To understand why the refusal mattered, you have first to understand, and to take seriously, the doctrine it was refusing. And that doctrine deserves respect, because it was one of the more brilliant pieces of applied mathematics of the entire war. In the autumn of 1942, the American daylight bombing campaign was in serious trouble, and the trouble was theoretical rather than practical. The United States had committed itself, over British objections, to bombing Germany in daylight. The Royal Air Force had already tried daylight raids, taken appalling losses, and retreated into the darkness, where a bomber could at least hide. The Americans intended to fly into German airspace in broad daylight, in clear air, visible from 50 miles away, and to do it without long-range fighter escort, because in 1942 no such fighter existed. The justification was the aeroplane itself. The B-17 was called a flying fortress for a reason. It carried, in its later versions, 13 heavy machine guns. The theory, argued for years at the Air Corps Tactical School, was that a formation of such aircraft carried enough defensive firepower to fight its way through any fighter opposition without help. The theory was about to be tested against the Luftwaffe, and it was going to fail, and a great many young men were going to die discovering that. The man who did the most to salvage it was a colonel named Curtis LeMay, who had arrived in England commanding the 305th Bombardment Group and who was, by temperament, the last person on earth to accept a comforting answer. LeMay looked at the theory and asked the question nobody had asked. It was not enough for a bomber to carry many guns. What mattered was how many of those guns could actually be brought to bear on a fighter at any given moment, from any given angle of attack. He worked it out with pencil and paper. A single bomber, alone, could bring only a fraction of its armament to bear on any one attacker. Most of its guns pointed the wrong way. But stack bombers in a precise three-dimensional lattice, some higher, some lower, some ahead, some behind, so that the fields of fire of each aircraft overlap with those of its neighbors, and a fighter attacking any one bomber flies into the guns of 6 or 8 others. The formation was not a collection of aircraft, it was a single weapon, and its firepower was a property of its geometry. This was the combat box. LeMay refined it through the winter of 1942 and into 1943, and it spread across the entire 8th Air Force because it demonstrably worked. He went further. He observed that bombers taking evasive action on the bomb run were both missing the target and destroying the integrity of the box, and he ordered his crews to fly straight and level through the flak, which they hated, and which unquestionably killed some of them, and which improved bombing accuracy and formation cohesion enough to save more than it cost. Understand what LeMay had built, because it is the crux of everything that follows. A system in which the individual aircraft was no longer the unit of survival. The formation was. A bomber was not a thing that flew and fought and lived. It was a node in a lattice, and its position was the only thing keeping the aircraft next to it alive. And a system like that has a merciless corollary, one that follows from the mathematics, with the inevitability of a proof. If the formation is the unit of survival, then anything that leaves the formation is already dead. The 8th Air Force had a word for an aircraft that could not hold its place. It called it a straggler. A straggler was a bomber that had lost an engine, or been holed in a fuel tank, or taken damage to its control surfaces, and could no longer maintain the speed or the altitude of the box. It fell behind. It drifted below, and the moment it did, it left the lattice of overlapping fire and became exactly what the whole doctrine had been designed to prevent. A single aeroplane, alone, in daylight, over Germany, with most of its guns pointing the wrong way. German fighter pilots understood this and hunted accordingly. They shadowed a formation, watching for the aircraft that began to sag out of position, and then fell on it in numbers. It was not a fight. It was arithmetic being collected. You will often hear it said that a wartime army study found roughly half of all B-17s lost in combat had left formation before they were destroyed. I have gone looking for that study and I cannot find it. The figure circulates widely, and I am not going to repeat it as fact, because I cannot show you where it comes from. What is beyond dispute, and what every account of the campaign confirms, is that German fighter pilots deliberately hunted the aircraft that fell out of the box, and that formation integrity was the single greatest protection a bomber crew had. To fall out of the box was, in most cases, to die, which produced the doctrine, and the doctrine was explicit, and it was brutal, and it was correct. The formation does not break for a straggler. You do not slow down for him. You do not descend to him. You do not detach aircraft to escort him. You do not turn back. The formation is a weapon, and its power lies in its integrity, and if it degrades itself to protect one damaged aircraft, it exposes 50 others to destruction. In order to give one a chance, it probably will not survive anyway. The mathematics is not ambiguous. The mission continues. The box holds. The straggler is on his own. Men flew away from their friends. They watched through their waist windows as the fighters closed on an aircraft they had trained with, crewed by men they had eaten breakfast with that morning, and they held formation, because breaking it would have killed more men than it saved. There are accounts of gunners weeping at their guns while this happened. They held anyway. That is what discipline in the 8th Air Force actually meant, and it is a great deal harder than courage. And this is the point that has to land before anything else in this story makes sense. Those men were right. The doctrine was right. Any other answer would have killed more Americans. The system that told 2 men over Polebrook to abandon their pilot was not evil or callous or stupid. It was the accumulated wisdom of an Air Force that had learned, at appalling cost, exactly what happened to aircraft that flew alone. The cost is worth stating precisely because it explains the ruthlessness. On August 17, 1943, the 8th Air Force struck the ball-bearing works at Schweinfurt and the Messerschmitt plants at Regensburg. 60 B-17s out of 376 did not come back, 16% of the force, gone in a single day. 2 months later, on October 14, 1943, they went back to Schweinfurt. Of 291 bombers dispatched, 60 were lost outright, another 17 were damaged beyond repair, and 121 more came home damaged. More than 600 airmen were killed, wounded, or missing. The airmen called it Black Thursday, and it effectively suspended deep penetration raids into Germany until long-range escort fighters arrived. At those rates of loss, the 25-mission tour that an American airman had to complete before he could go home was not a test of endurance. It was a statistical death sentence. The historian Donald Miller puts the accounting in terms that are hard to absorb. The 8th Air Force, one command, flying from airfields in the English countryside, suffered 26,000 fatal casualties. That is more men killed than the entire United States Marine Corps lost in the whole of the Second World War, in every battle, on every island, across the entire Pacific. Miller notes that 77% of the Americans who flew against Germany before D-Day ended as casualties. 350,000 men served with the 8th Air Force. 26,000 of them died. Around 28,000 more ended the war in German prison camps. That is the machine. That is the context in which a lieutenant and a sergeant, sitting in the cockpit of a bomber over their own airfield, were told to jump. The order to jump was not cowardice being urged upon them. It was the entire institutional logic of the American bombing campaign, speaking through a radio, and it was telling them the truth. 2 men could live. They were being offered their lives by an organization that had every reason to want them alive, because trained aircrew were the scarcest thing the 8th Air Force had. If this kind of history matters to you, the doctrine and the arithmetic and the decisions behind what actually happened in the sky, then consider subscribing and leaving a like. It genuinely helps this sort of detailed work find the people who want it. Now let us go back to the aeroplane, and this time let us follow it from the beginning, because what happened aboard that fortress is stranger and more specific than the summary suggests. The aircraft was a Boeing B-17G, serial number 4231763, carrying the fuselage code TUA, and painted with the name 10 horsepower. It belonged to the 510th Bombardment Squadron of the 351st Bombardment Group, flying out of Royal Air Force Polebrook in Northamptonshire, a base the Americans knew by the designation Station 110. February 20, 1944, was the opening day of what the 8th Air Force called Operation Argument, and what everybody else has called, ever since, Big Week. It was a sustained maximum effort against the German aircraft industry, an attempt to force the Luftwaffe into a battle of attrition it could not win, and it was flown in weather that the meteorologists had warned against. The 351st put up 39 fortresses that morning. The target was in the Leipzig area. 10 horsepower carried the standard 10-man crew. In the left-hand seat, the pilot, First Lieutenant Clarence Nelson. Beside him, in the right-hand seat, the co-pilot, Flight Officer Ronald Bartley. In the nose, the bombardier, Second Lieutenant Joseph Martin, and the navigator, Second Lieutenant Walter Truemper. In the top turret, directly behind the cockpit, the flight engineer, Staff Sergeant Archibald Mathies. At the radio position, Sergeant Joseph Rex. In the ball turret slung beneath the belly, Sergeant Carl Moore. At the waist guns, Sergeant Thomas Sowell and Sergeant Russell Robinson, and in the tail, Sergeant Magnus Hagbo. Walter Truemper was born in Aurora, Illinois, in the autumn of 1918, and he entered the service from there. He was a navigator, which meant charts and a drift meter and dead reckoning, and it did not mean flying. February 20 was Archibald Mathies' second combat mission, his second. He had been made a staff sergeant 3 days earlier, and Archibald Mathies was not, in the technical sense, an American at all when he was born. He was born on June 3, 1918, in Stonehouse, in Lanarkshire, in Scotland. His family emigrated when he was a small child, sailing to the United States and settling in the coal country of western Pennsylvania. He was a Scottish miner's son who ended up in the top turret of an American bomber over Germany, and he is one of a very small number of foreign-born airmen to receive the Medal of Honor. Over enemy territory, on the way to or from the target, 10 horsepower was attacked head-on by German fighters. A cannon shell entered the cockpit. The effect of a 20mm explosive shell detonating in the confined space of a B-17 flight deck does not need to be described in detail. Flight Officer Bartley, in the right-hand seat, was killed instantly. Lieutenant Nelson, in the left-hand seat, was catastrophically wounded and unconscious. The cockpit windows were shattered, and the air at 20,000 feet, at temperatures far below freezing, came through at more than 200 miles per hour. Both pilots were out of the fight in a single second, and the fortress fell out of the formation and out of the sky. The aircraft went into a spiral dive. It left the combat box, and by every rule we have just examined, it was now a straggler, alone over Germany, with nobody flying it and 9 living men aboard. The man who saved them first was Sergeant Carl Moore, in the top turret, the station immediately behind the pilots. He was the closest man to the cockpit, and he was the man who could reach it. He got to the controls and hauled the bomber out of its spiral. By the time he leveled it, the aircraft had fallen roughly 15,000 feet. He received the Distinguished Service Cross. His part in this is almost always forgotten in favor of what came afterwards, which is an injustice, because without Moore, there is no afterwards. And note where Mathies had been sitting. The flight engineer's normal station is the top turret. But that morning the engineer was in the ball, the sphere slung under the aircraft's belly, which is what his Medal of Honor citation says. Mathies had to climb out of the ball turret and go forward to reach the flight deck at all. But Moore was a gunner. He could arrest a dive. He could not fly a bomber across Europe. Control passed to 2 men, Walter Truemper, the navigator who had failed pilot training, and Archibald Mathies, the flight engineer, the Scottish miner's son from the top turret. Between them, they had the aircraft. Bartley's body was in the right-hand seat. Nelson was in the left-hand seat, unconscious, alive, and immovable. Accounts of what followed describe the 2 men working the controls in the shattered cockpit, exposed to the freezing slipstream, with the aircraft badly damaged and their commander dying between them. They flew it home. 500 miles, roughly, from the German target area, across occupied Europe, across the North Sea, in a crippled aircraft, outside the formation, alone, precisely the condition that the entire doctrine of the 8th Air Force said was fatal, and they did it with a navigator and a mechanic at the controls. That flight, on its own, is one of the more remarkable pieces of airmanship of the war, and almost nobody has heard of it, because of what happened at the end of it. They reached Polebrook, and at Polebrook, the arithmetic caught up with them. There is a specific and dreadful physical problem at the center of this story, and it is the hinge on which everything turns. A parachute was not a passive device. It required a conscious man. He had to clip the pack to his harness, move himself to a hatch, get clear of the structure, and pull a ripcord. An unconscious man could do none of that. He could in principle be fitted with a chute by his crewmates and pushed out with the ripcord pulled for him, and this was occasionally done. But Clarence Nelson could not be moved. He was strapped into a pilot's seat, gravely injured, and any attempt to extract him from that seat, in a damaged aircraft that required 2 men on the controls to remain airborne, would have meant letting go of the controls. The moment Truemper and Mathies let go, the fortress would fall. It would fall on them, on Nelson, and quite possibly on an English village. So there was no version of this in which Nelson jumped. There was only a version in which the aircraft was abandoned and flew on until it fell into the ground with him inside it. Joseph Martin, the bombardier, had already gone. He jettisoned the bombs and bailed out over Germany when the aircraft seemed finished, which it was, and he came down in enemy territory and spent the rest of the war as a prisoner. He is not a coward in this story. He did what a man in a doomed bomber is supposed to do. Over Polebrook, the rest of the crew were ordered to jump. Moore, Rex, Sowell, Robinson and Hagbo went out over their own airfield. They landed safely. They lived. 2 men stayed. Somebody had to look at the aircraft before anything could be decided, and so an officer went up. Major Elzéar Ledoux, commanding the 509th Bombardment Squadron, took off in a fortress named My Princess, and formed up alongside 10 horsepower, close enough to assess the damage and to talk to the men inside. What Ledoux saw was a wrecked bomber being flown by 2 men who were not pilots. His assessment, and the command's assessment, was blunt and professionally correct. They could not land it. They would be killed attempting it. They were ordered to bail out. And here the record gives us the exchange, in the language of the citation, in that flat War Department prose that was never trying to be literature and which achieves it accidentally. Truemper and the engineer replied that the pilot was still alive but could not be moved, and that they would not desert him. Not could not, would not. The order was repeated. They were told again that the landing attempt would kill them. They refused again. And eventually the command at Polebrook gave them what they were asking for, which was permission to try. They flew 2 approaches. Both times the aircraft was not lined up, or not stable, or not right, and both times they went around, which itself takes considerable skill in a damaged 4-engined bomber. Ledoux stayed with them, flying alongside, talking them through it. On the 3rd attempt, 10 horsepower came down short. It struck the ground on rising terrain near the village of Glatton and disintegrated. Walter Truemper was killed. Archibald Mathies was killed. Clarence Nelson, the man they had refused to leave, died of the injuries he had received over Germany. On June 22, 1944, by War Department General Orders No. 52, the Medal of Honor was awarded posthumously to both Second Lieutenant Walter Truemper and Staff Sergeant Archibald Mathies. It is one of very few occasions in the history of the decoration on which 2 members of the same aircraft received it for the same act, and the crew of 10 horsepower is frequently described as the most decorated bomber crew in the 8th Air Force. Now hold that image and go and stand somewhere else entirely, because to understand why the United States Army looked at that decision and called it the highest thing a soldier can do, rather than what its own doctrine implied it was, a waste of 2 trained men and an aeroplane, you have to leave the sky altogether. Leave England. Leave 1944. Go to Virginia, to a wooded bluff above the Potomac River, about 15 miles south of Washington, to a place that appeared on no map and had no name. It had an address. The address was Post Office Box 1142. That was all anybody was permitted to know. Mail went to Post Office Box 1142, and the men and women who worked there did not tell their families where they went in the mornings. The site was a former coastal defense installation called Fort Hunt, and it had been quietly taken over in 1942 for purposes that would remain classified for more than 60 years. Part of what happened at Fort Hunt was the interrogation of German prisoners, including scientists and submariners. But another part, established in October 1942, was an organization designated MISX, and MISX is the thing that explains the Medal of Honor. MISX was the American Escape and Evasion Service. It was modeled directly on the British organization known as MI9, and its remit was the men who were about to be lost. The United States National Park Service, which now administers the Fort Hunt site and has done a great deal to bring its history out of the dark, describes the work plainly. MISX instructed servicemen before they deployed to Europe in the techniques of escape and evasion. It equipped them with devices to help them evade capture or to escape if captured. It maintained coded correspondence with American prisoners inside German camps, using selected men known as code users, so that information could flow both ways through the German censors. And it invented from nothing 2 entirely fictitious prisoner relief organizations, phantom charities that existed only on paper, whose parcels went into the camps carrying compasses, maps printed on tissue paper, counterfeit German currency, and radio components concealed inside ordinary objects. Consider what that actually is: an institution funded by the taxpayer, staffed by intelligence officers, operating under total secrecy, whose entire purpose was to reach individual men who had already been written off by the operational arithmetic. Men who were, by the doctrine we have just examined, no longer the 8th Air Force's problem. The 8th Air Force did not go back for them. MISX did. And MISX was only one piece of an apparatus that was being assembled, quietly, in parallel with the bombing campaign, and which almost nobody in the aircraft knew existed. The second piece was a form. On June 11, 1943, the United States Army Air Forces instituted a document called the Missing Air Crew Report. Whenever an aircraft or a crew failed to return and was declared missing, the unit was required to file one within 48 hours. The report recorded the aircraft, its serial number, its engines by serial number, its weapons by serial number, every man aboard by name and service number and next of kin, the last known position, the weather, the time, and the eyewitness statements of anyone who had seen what happened, including how many parachutes were observed leaving the aircraft. How many parachutes were observed? That was a field on the form. Men in other bombers, in the middle of a battle, were expected to count the parachutes coming out of a burning aeroplane, and to remember the number, and to report it, and the Army wrote it down and kept it. The National Archives of the United States holds over 16,000 of these case files, 16,000 aircraft, tens of thousands of men, and the system leaked. It leaked badly. The National Archives itself records that somewhere between 30 and 40% of all incidents were never reported through a missing aircrew report at all, even after the requirement came into force. Units were exhausted, records were lost, aircraft simply did not come back, and nobody filled in the form. I am not going to pretend the machinery was flawless, because it was not. But look at what happened next, because this is the tell. After the war ended, the War Department went back and compiled missing aircrew reports retrospectively for aircraft lost before the requirement even existed, and for the losses that had been missed. It did this for one stated reason: to recover the remains of men who had not come home. The paperwork was created after the war was over, for men who were already dead, in order to go and find their bodies. The missing aircrew report served no operational purpose whatsoever. It did not help win the war. It did not put bombs on target. It did not shoot down a single German fighter. It was a pure accounting document, and what it accounted for was people. Its function was to ensure that no American airman could vanish from the record without the United States government knowing precisely who he was, where he was last seen, and what the men who saw him last believed had happened to him. The third piece came afterwards, and it has never stopped. When the war ended, the American Graves Registration Service began an operation called the Return of the World War II Dead Program, and it did what the name says. It went out into Europe and the Pacific and the ocean, and it retrieved them, crash site by crash site, grave by grave, and it brought them home, at enormous cost, for years. And that work did not finish. It has not finished now. Today the responsibility sits with the Defense Prisoner of War and Missing in Action Accounting Agency, and its figures, reported at the start of this year, are these. 71,806 Americans remain unaccounted for from the Second World War. The agency is still recovering them. It still excavates crash sites in French forests and Pacific lagoons. In 2023, it identified a staff sergeant from a B-24 that went down in 1944 and gave him back his name and buried him. 80 years, and the United States is still, at public expense, going back for individual men who fell out of the box. There was a fourth piece, and it was the one the aircrew could actually see, and it was the one that failed them most often. The water was the enemy that nobody talks about. A bomber returning from Germany crossed the North Sea, and a damaged bomber frequently did not finish crossing it. Men who had survived the fighters and the flak ditched in freezing water and died of exposure within minutes, and for the first 2 years of the campaign, there was almost nothing anybody could do about it. The British had been working on the problem longer, because the British had been losing men into the Channel since 1940. Their solutions were ingenious and slightly mad. The boat designer Uffe Fox devised an airborne lifeboat, a self-righting wooden vessel with engines and sails and supplies, which was carried under a bomber and dropped by parachute to a crew floating in the sea. And from 1943 onwards, Royal Air Force aircraft went out and dropped them. It is an extraordinary object to contemplate. It is a boat that arrives from the sky. The Americans built their own air-sea rescue service using Catalina flying boats, and later modified fortresses and superfortresses carrying lifeboats slung beneath them, and the crews called them Dumbo. In the Pacific, the system worked well and rescued men in numbers. Over the North Sea in 1943, it did not. The figure is grim, and it is worth stating honestly. Of 8th Air Force crews who reported that they were going into the water, only around 28% were saved. 7 out of 10 men who called for help from the sea did not come home. That figure is the honest counterweight to everything else in this story. The intention was total. The capability was not. An institution can refuse to abandon a man and still fail to reach him, and over that cold grey water, it failed. But notice what it did not do. It did not stop trying, and it did not stop counting. Every one of those men went into a missing aircrew report. Every one of them was searched for. The failure was in the aeroplanes and the boats and the radios. It was never in the decision to go and look. And it is worth asking whether the other air forces did the same, because if they all did, there is nothing distinctive here to explain. They did not. Royal Air Force Bomber Command flew at night, largely without formations, which meant it had no combat box, and therefore no doctrine of the straggler, because in the darkness, every aircraft was already alone. Its losses were catastrophic, worse proportionally than the Americans suffered, and its air-sea rescue work was genuinely pioneering. But it did not build anything comparable to the missing aircrew report as a universal, mandatory, per-aircraft accounting document, and it did not build anything on the scale of the post-war American recovery effort. The German Air Force, fighting for most of the period over its own territory, had a different problem entirely, and by 1944 it was losing pilots faster than it could train them, and had neither the resources nor the reach to go looking for the ones who fell into the sea or into Russia. The American apparatus was not the natural or obvious way to run an air war. It was a choice, and it was an expensive one, and almost nobody else made it. And now put the two things beside each other, because this is the whole argument. The United States Army Air Forces ran, simultaneously, two entirely different theories of what a man was. In the air, in the operational doctrine, in the combat box, a man was not the unit of value at all. The aircraft was barely the unit of value. The formation was. The individual was a component in a lattice, and the lattice was what survived, and if a component fell out of the lattice closed up and flew on, and did not look back. That was correct, and it saved thousands of lives, and it was taught and enforced and obeyed. On the ground, in the bureaucracy, in the filing cabinets at Fort Hunt, and in the 16,000 missing aircrew reports, and in the graves registration teams, and in an agency that is still digging today, a man was the only unit of value there was. Not the aircraft, not the formation, the name, the individual, irreplaceable, specific, named human being who would be searched for, coded messages passed to, sent counterfeit currency in a fake charity parcel, counted, recorded, looked for, dug up, and brought home. Both of these were the same institution. Both of these were operating at the same moment, in the same war, over the same men, and nobody appears to have noticed that they were incompatible. They were incompatible because they answer the same question differently. The doctrine of the combat box says the individual may be abandoned when the system requires it. The apparatus of the missing aircrew report says the individual may never be abandoned under any circumstances. Ever. Not even after the war is over. Not even after 80 years. Not even after everyone who knew him is dead. For most of the war, the two theories never met, because they operated in different places. The doctrine lived in the sky. The apparatus lived in filing cabinets in Virginia and in the offices of Graves Registration. An airman flying over Germany experienced the doctrine every single day and had almost certainly never heard of MISX, which was classified, or thought for one moment about the missing aircrew report, which would only be filled out about him after he was already gone. They met head-on exactly once in this story, inside the cockpit of a B-17 over an English airfield, on the evening of February 20, 1944. Two men were sitting at the controls of a straggler. The doctrine said, correctly, "Jump, the aircraft is lost, you are a component, and the component can be saved." And something else in that same army, something that had never been written into any manual, and never issued as an order, and never taught in any school, said the man in the left-hand seat has a name, and you do not leave him. They obeyed the second one. And when the War Department looked at what they had done, it did not court-martial them posthumously for hazarding an aircraft. It reached for the Medal of Honor because at some level the institution recognized its own second theory looking back at it, and knew which of the two it actually believed in. If this is the kind of history you want more of, the argument underneath the story, rather than just the story, hitting the like button and subscribing genuinely does help it reach the people who care about getting it right. The pattern is not confined to one aeroplane, and that is what makes it a pattern rather than an anecdote. 9 months after Polebrook, on November 9, 1944, a B-17G, named Lady Jeanette, serial number 4297904, of the 729th Bombardment Squadron, 452nd Bombardment Group, was hit by anti-aircraft fire over the marshalling yards at Saarbrücken while supporting the American Third Army. The damage was extreme. An engine was torn away and the fuel was burning. 3 engines were damaged. Fire streamed back along the fuselage. Flares in the cockpit ignited, fed by hydraulic fluid, and the interphone was destroyed, so the pilot could no longer speak to his crew. The radio operator, Technical Sergeant Robert Dunlap, had lost an arm below the elbow. A tourniquet was applied. He lost consciousness. The pilot was First Lieutenant Donald Gott. The co-pilot was Second Lieutenant William Metzger. Between them, they made an assessment which they both understood to be a death sentence. Dunlap could not survive a parachute descent. He was unconscious, he had lost an arm, and even if they threw him out with a parachute and pulled the ripcord for him, he would land in German-held territory and bleed to death before anyone reached him. They decided to keep the burning bomber in the air, cross into friendly territory, and put it down, so that Dunlap could reach an American aid station. Metzger went back through the aircraft, because the interphone was dead, to order the rest of the crew out. 5 men jumped and lived. The tail gunner, Staff Sergeant Hermann Kriminger, did not. His parachute deployed inside the aircraft, was dragged out over the tail, and he was killed against the tail surfaces, and there was nothing anybody aboard could do about it. Gott and Metzger flew the burning fortress into France and attempted the landing. The aircraft came down in the Bois de Hattonville, in the Meuse, and it burned. Gott died. Metzger died. Dunlap, the man they had stayed for, died. Both pilots received the Medal of Honor. There is a complication with this case which honesty requires me to state. The official citations describe a crash that does not match the physical facts of the Hattonville site, and the discrepancy is well documented. There is also a body of research, principally by the author Willis Cole, alleging a deliberate cover-up around the crash site and the handling of the remains. That thesis is contested, it is not independently corroborated, and I am not going to present it as fact. What is not in dispute is the flight, the decision, the reason for it, and the deaths. And so it goes on, the same choice made again and again by men who did not know each other. First Lieutenant Edward Michael of the 305th Bombardment Group, on April 11, 1944, discovered that his bombardier's parachute had been shredded and was useless. He understood immediately that if the aircraft was abandoned, that one man died. He crash-landed the bomber instead, and everyone lived. Medal of Honor. Second Lieutenant Robert Femoyer of the 447th Bombardment Group, on November 2, 1944, was hit by flak fragments in the side and back over Merseburg. He was the navigator, and he was the only man aboard who could get the crippled aircraft home. He refused morphine, because morphine would have clouded his mind, and he had himself propped up so that he could read his charts, and he navigated the aeroplane for more than 2 hours in that condition, and he permitted the morphine only when they were over the channel and he was no longer needed. He died shortly after landing. Medal of Honor. He remains the only navigator ever to receive it. Technical Sergeant Forrest Vosler, radio operator, on December 20, 1943, was wounded in the legs by cannon fire over Bremen and then blinded by fragments in both eyes. Blind, he kept firing. Blind, he repaired the radio by touch and sent the distress signals that brought help, and when the aircraft ditched in the North Sea, blind, he held on to the badly wounded tail gunner to stop him sliding off the wing into the water. He survived, and he recovered part of his sight. Medal of Honor. Second Lieutenant John Morgan, on July 26, 1943, and his citation says the 28th, which the records of his own bomb group say is wrong, found himself flying a fortress with one hand while fending off, with the other, his own pilot, whose skull had been split open by a fighter's cannon shell and who was thrashing on the controls in his death throes. He held that aeroplane for 2 hours, and he did it because there were still men in the back of it, some of them wounded, who would die if it went down. The navigator, Keith Koski, described afterwards what he found when he climbed forward. Morgan was flying the plane with one hand, holding the half-dead pilot off with the other hand, and he had been doing it for over 2 hours. Morgan got the Medal of Honor and was later shot down anyway and spent the rest of the war as a prisoner, which makes him the only man to become a prisoner of war after receiving the decoration. And then there is Maynard Smith, who is in this story to stop it becoming sentimental. Smith was a ball turret gunner with the 306th Bombardment Group, and on May 1, 1943, on his very first combat mission, returning from the submarine pens at Saint-Nazaire, his fortress caught fire. 3 men bailed out into the sea and were never seen again. Smith stayed. He fought the fire by hand. He treated the wounds of the tail gunner. He manned the waist guns when the fighters came in, then went back to fighting the fire, then back to the guns, for well over an hour, and the aircraft got home. He became the first enlisted airman to receive the Medal of Honor. He was also, by every account of every officer who ever had to deal with him, an insufferable man. He was insubordinate. He was disliked. He was later demoted. And when the day came for the Secretary of War to present him with the highest decoration his country could bestow, they had to go and find him, because he had been put on kitchen duty as a punishment and was washing dishes. That is the correct note to end this list on, because it demolishes any idea that the men who would not abandon their crews were a particular type of person. They were not. Some of them were exemplary, and some of them were difficult, and one of them was washing pots when they came to pin the medal on him. Whatever they were obeying, it was not character. It was something else, and it was in the institution rather than in the men. And here, it is necessary to stop and be careful, because there is a story that everybody thinks they know, and it is not true, and this piece would not be worth making if it repeated it. The story is the ball turret gunner. The Sperry ball turret was a sphere roughly 44 inches across, slung beneath the belly of the bomber, in which the smallest man in the crew sat folded up around 250 caliber machine guns. It was so small that a parachute would not fit inside it, so the ball turret gunner was the one man in the aircraft who flew without his parachute on his body. It hung on a hook in the fuselage above him. To get out, the turret had to be rotated until its hatch aligned with the opening in the fuselage, usually with a waist gunner helping from inside. If the power failed, and the manual crank could not be worked, a man could be trapped in there. And on a B-17, unlike the B-24, the ball did not retract. A belly landing would crush it. The story that grew from this is that a crew, unable to free their trapped gunner and unable to lower their landing gear, brought the aircraft down anyway, and that the pilot told him over the interphone that they would ride it down together. It is one of the most famous images of the air war, and it cannot be verified. It appears to trace back to the broadcaster Andy Rooney, who covered the 8th Air Force as a correspondent for Stars and Stripes, and who said he had witnessed such a landing, though he was himself vague about the details. It was later retold, with embellishments, by Ronald Reagan, whose version supplied the line about riding it down together, and which is a documented invention. It was dramatized in film and television. Researchers have gone looking for the aircraft, the date, the crew, the name of the gunner. Nobody has found them. Be fair to Rooney. He insisted to the end of his life that he had seen it, and he eventually placed it with the 91st Bombardment Group at Bassingbourn, but he never recorded the man's name. He did not publish the account until the 1980s, roughly 40 years afterwards, and no aircraft, no date, and no gunner has ever been matched to it by anyone, including the veterans of the group he named. Reagan's version is worse. The pilot sitting down on the floor, the line about riding it down together, all of that is a conflation with a 1944 Hollywood film in which the aircraft is a Pacific torpedo bomber. The gunner cannot jump because his legs are injured rather than because he is trapped, and the line is not even the same line. Researchers have also pointed out an awkward technical problem with Rooney's account. The landing gear of a B-17 could be cranked down by hand. I am telling you this because the story is emotionally perfect and factually unsupported, and because the truth does not need it. The truth is Polebrook. The truth is Truemper and Mathies, with names and serial numbers and a citation and a grave, and they are better than the legend because they happened. So what actually is the thing that Truemper and Mathies obeyed, if it was not doctrine, and not an order, and not a regulation? Here is the answer, and it is genuinely surprising. The phrase "leave no man behind" is not, and never has been, formal United States military doctrine. It appears today in the Soldier's Creed and the Ranger Creed, and analysts who have gone looking for it in the actual body of American military doctrine report that it is not represented in any official publication at all. It is a culture of the armed services, and one such analysis notes, dryly, that it carries significant risk. And here is the part that ought to stop you. The line in the Soldier's Creed, "I will never leave a fallen comrade," was not written into that creed until 2003. It was codified nearly 60 years after Polebrook, which means that on February 20, 1944, when two men in a cockpit over Northamptonshire refused an order, the principle they were obeying did not exist in writing anywhere in the United States Armed Forces, not in a manual, not in a creed, not in a regulation, nowhere. Significant risk. That is the understatement of some magnitude, because the risk is what killed Truemper and Mathies and Gott and Metzger and Femoyer, and the risk is precisely the point. The United States Army never wrote it down because it could not write it down. It could not be written down. The moment you put it in a manual as an order, it becomes a tactical instruction, and as a tactical instruction, it is indefensible. It would require pilots to hazard aircraft and crews for individuals. It would break formations. It would lose more men than it saved. Any staff officer with a pencil could demonstrate in 5 minutes that it is operationally insane, and every one of them would be right. So the Army did the only thing it could do. It wrote the opposite into its doctrine, which was correct, and it built the entire opposing principle into its bureaucracy instead, where it could do no tactical harm, into the missing aircrew report, into MISX, into Graves registration, into an agency that is still digging up French forests in the 2020s. It made the refusal to abandon a property of the institution's memory rather than a property of its orders, and then it gave the Medal of Honor to the men who dragged it back into the cockpit, where it had never been supposed to go. Look at what the decoration was actually doing. The Medal of Honor is awarded for actions above and beyond the call of duty. Read that phrase with the doctrine in mind, and it is almost a confession. Above and beyond the call of duty means, precisely, that duty did not require this. Duty required something else. Duty said jump. What Truemper and Mathies did was not their duty, and the United States Army knew it, and said so in the citation, and honored them for it in the highest terms it had. That is the resolution of the paradox. The 8th Air Force was not being inconsistent. It was being deliberately, structurally, two things at once, because it needed to be. It needed a doctrine that would abandon a man, or it could not have bombed Germany at all, and it needed to be an institution that would never abandon a man, or it could not have asked young men to get into those aircraft in the first place. Ask what a 22-year-old radio operator, at the start of a 25-mission tour with the loss rates of 1943, was actually relying on when he climbed aboard. He knew the numbers. Everybody knew the numbers. He was not relying on his odds, because his odds were bad. He was relying on something he could not have articulated, and which was nowhere in his training. He was relying on the belief that if it went wrong, the men around him would not leave him, and that if he vanished, somebody would keep looking. He was right about the second part. 16,000 missing aircrew reports say he was right, and 71,806 names still being searched for, 80 years later, say he was right. And on February 20, 1944, over Polebrook, 2 men made him right about the first part as well, at the cost of their lives, and to no practical purpose whatsoever. Which brings us back to the aeroplane on its third approach. There is a temptation, watching 10 horsepower come around for the last time, to make the two men in it into something they were not, to make them tragic or futile, or to suggest that they made a mistake. They did not fail. Their nerve did not fail. Their airmanship extraordinarily did not fail either. A navigator and a flight engineer flew a wrecked 4-engined bomber 500 miles across, occupied Europe and the North Sea, and brought it to the threshold of its own runway, which nobody had any right to expect of them, and they very nearly landed it, twice. What killed them was that there was no correct answer available. The doctrine was right, and it said leave him. The other thing, the unwritten thing, was also right, and it said do not. Both of those propositions were true at the same time inside one cockpit, and the aircraft was descending, and somebody had to choose. They chose the one that was not written down. Archibald Mathies is remembered on a memorial plaque in the parish church at Polebrook, in the village his bomb group flew from, in the country next to the one where he was born. His name is on the Roll of Honour in St. Paul's Cathedral in London, among the American dead who flew from England. There are buildings named after him and after Walter Truemper on American air bases. 80 years after the crash, people gathered near where the aeroplane came down to remember them. The 8th Air Force awarded 17 Medals of Honor in the Second World War, 17 out of 350,000 men. Look at what those 17 were given for, and a pattern emerges that has nothing to do with aggression. Almost none of them were awarded for destroying the enemy. They were awarded, overwhelmingly, for refusing to leave somebody. A blind man holding a wounded gunner on a wing in the North Sea. A navigator refusing morphine so that he could bring 9 other men home. A pilot fighting his own dying commander for the controls because they were wounded in the back. A navigator and an engineer who would not desert a man who could not be moved. That is what the United States Army Air Forces chose to say was the highest thing an airman could do. Not the bombing, not the killing, the staying. An institution reveals what it believes not in its doctrine, which is written by staff officers solving problems, but in what it chooses to honor, which is written by people deciding what kind of thing they want to be. The doctrine of the 8th Air Force said, abandon the straggler, and the doctrine was correct, and it was obeyed, and it should have been. And then the same Air Force took its highest decoration and pinned it, 17 times, almost entirely on men who had refused to abandon anybody at all. The men in that cockpit over Polebrook did not know any of this. They had never heard of Fort Hunt. They had not read the War College study that would be written 60 years later. They had a dying man between them who could not be moved, and an order to jump, and the light was going, and they had to make an approach. What they knew was the only thing the American military never quite dared to put in writing, and which it has spent 80 years and untold millions of dollars proving anyway, in forests in France, and on islands in the Pacific, and in laboratories in Hawaii, where the bones of missing airmen are still being given back their names. You do not leave him. If this account gave you something worth thinking about, then subscribing and leaving a like is what keeps this kind of history, the argument as well as the story, reaching the people who want it told properly.